what's going on, and welcome to this tutorial on creating fire inside of After Effects using CC Particle World. My name's Steve Liederbach. Now, I will mention that when it comes to working with particles inside of After Effects, most motion graphics artists will tell you that using Trapcode Particular is the best way to go, and I'm certainly not going to argue with that. But Trapcode Particular is a third-party plugin, and if you haven't had a chance to purchase it, you should know that you're more than capable of creating this kind of effect using just the built-in tools inside of After Effects. And with a little bit of work, you can achieve some very convincing results. Plus, if you're new to After Effects, I think it's especially important to understand how a basic particle system like CC Particle World functions before you purchase something more complex. Now let's take a quick look at what it is we're going to be creating. If you ask me, that looks pretty convincing. Now, we've got a few different things going on here, but I promise none of it's rocket science. First, we have a very organic looking fire. I've also added a light flicker to help sell the effect. And last but not least, we have a very simple camera move closing in on our fire. Okay, so back in After Effects, I have my original composition still open, and I'd like to show you one more thing before we get started. I'll first switch this to half resolution, and then I'll select my Orbit Camera tool, which is also the C key for those of you who may not know, and I'll just orbit around my fire here. And as you can see, it is 100% 3D. Okay, let's get started. I'll create a new composition and call it CC Fire. And I'll use the 1280 by 720 settings, square pixels at, we'll change this to 24 frames per second, and we'll make the duration about 5 seconds long. And click OK. Next, I'll create a new solid by choosing Layer, New Solid. I'll name it Fire. I'll make it black and choose OK. And making sure that my solid is still selected, I'll choose Effect, Simulation, CC Particle World. And if I just scrub forward on the timeline a little bit, you can see we have our particles emitting from the center. And right away, we'll start making some changes. And I'm going to start by turning off our grid. We don't need any of these on. By the way, I am working out of After Effects CS5, so if any of these settings look a little bit funky to you, that's because Adobe has moved a few things around in Particle World. However, all of the previous versions of After Effects have the same Particle World settings. So all you need to do is find your grid section and just turn it off. And to open up the Producer, the Physics, and the Particle tabs. Now I'm going to reset the velocity to 0, and the gravity to 0 as well. And then I'm going to change the animation to fire. Next, we'll move down to the Particle tab and change the particle type from a line to a lens bubble. Now it appears as though we've lost our particles, but they are still there, and the reason we can't see them is because we chose to make our solid the color black. However, there is a reason why I chose that color, and that's because later on we're going to be working with Luma and Alpha channels. So for now, all we need to do to see our particles is to come down to this icon and click on the transparency. So there's our particles looking kind of like a dark cloud. So we'll just adjust that by giving it a little bit of gravity. That looks okay for now. Now we're going to be coming back into CC Particle World a little bit later, but for now, let's start adding some more effects so that we can start better defining the shape and look of our fire. So now we'll choose Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Blur, and we'll change the blur dimensions to vertical. And we'll crank up the blurriness maybe to about 25. You know what? I'm going to jump back into Particle World really quickly here and just increase the birth rate a little bit. And I'll also bring the Y position up a little, or down. And we'll boost the gravity up just a little. Okay, moving on. And now we'll choose Effect, Distort, Turbulent Displace. And if we scrub through the timeline here, you'll see that not only did we distort the shape of the particles, but also the way that they move. But let's change a few of these settings, though. First, we want the size to be pretty small. Actually, very small, maybe say about 10. We'll leave the amount at 50 for now. And then the last thing we want to do is animate the evolution to give it more of a random look. And to do that, we're just going to use a very simple expression. So we'll hold down Alt or Command on the Mac, click on the stopwatch, and in the text bar we'll type time times 250. And now our turbulent displace effect will continuously evolve throughout the rest of our composition. So the movement of our fire is coming along very nicely, so now let's start adding some color. And we're going to be doing that with a very powerful effect called Colorama. So let's choose Effect, Color Correction, Colorama. I'm going to close some of these tabs here. And we'll open the Input phase and change this tab from Intensity to Alpha. Then we'll open the Modify tab and uncheck Modify Alpha. Then we'll open the Output cycle and change the preset from None to Fire. Now, we can start customizing these colors by moving some of these arrows around on the color wheel or getting rid of them, but I'm really going to leave most of the stylizing and customizing up to you. Even now, this looks pretty good, but for the sake of this tutorial, we'll just modify a few things. I'm going to remove a few of these colors, and to do that, all you need to do is click on the arrow and drag it off the color wheel. You can also click on these arrows and move them around the color wheel to add more or less of that specific color. Let's just get rid of this one and this one. Now we might want to adjust some of these settings later, but I'm pretty happy with the way this looks right now. So I'm going to move on to the next step, which is to create some contrast and a little bit more harshness to our fire. And we'll do that by choosing Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Sharpen. And we really don't need to crank this up too much. Actually, maybe about 32 is pretty good. Now, the last thing I did in my original example was choose Effect, Stylize, Glow. And I'm going to turn the transparency off now that we can see our fire. And I'll crank up the radius. And maybe bring up the threshold just a little bit. And maybe we'll bring down the sharpen amount just a touch. And let's just create a quick RAM preview. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, so let's move away from the fire for a little bit and start working on our ground. Now, I am going to be using this texture that I downloaded from cgtextures.com, which is a great resource for motion graphics artists to find all kinds of textures that they can use in their projects, and it's free to sign up. But you can really use any kind of texture you want, or for now you can just create a new solid. But I wanted to choose a ground texture with some nice detail so I can illustrate one more effect we're going to be adding to our fire in a few minutes. So let's close our Fire tab and drop our ground layer beneath it. And let's make it a 3D layer by checking on the box below the 3D icon. And before I do anything else, I'm going to quickly color correct it using a tint and curves effect. So choose Effect, Color Correction, Tint, and then we'll choose Effect, Color Correction, Curves. And we'll just bring down the amount of tint a little bit to maybe about 53%. And with the curves selected, I'm going to give it some contrast. And maybe bring up the red just a touch. And maybe the green. And that looks pretty good. And so now let's rotate this flat. We'll bring down our transform properties and rotate it 90 degrees or negative 90 on its X rotation. And bring it down. Bring it forward. Okay, let's create a new camera. 35 millimeters is good. And I'll hit C to bring up the camera tools. And we'll just bring this up a little bit. I'll hit C again and zoom it out just a touch. And maybe orbit it just a little bit so we can see. And then I'll select the ground layer again. And with the arrow key, just push this back a little. Maybe over some. Alright, now we'll create a new light. And we'll make it a spotlight. And we'll give it more of kind of like a light orange-ish color. Click OK. And we'll bring down the transform options. And actually, we can play around with it over here. And let's start positioning it. So we'll bring it up. And we'll take the point of interest. Maybe just bring it down a little. That's positioned pretty well. And in my previous example, I created a light flicker because to me that helps add to the realism of this effect. So the way we'll do that is click on the light options and add a simple wiggle expression to the intensity. And to do that, we'll hold down Alt and left click on the stopwatch. And in the text box, we'll just type wiggle, parentheses, 10, comma, 20, close parentheses. And what this means, if you don't know, is that 10 times a second, our intensity is going to wiggle at a rate of 20. So now we can click out of the text box and do a quick RAM preview. And that's probably just enough. Okay, so we really only have a few things left to do to our fire. It's looking pretty good. But before we do that, let's animate our camera so that I can show you one of the problems that you're going to run into with most particle systems. So we can close out on our light and open up the camera. And we'll move in about 12 or 15 frames or so. And click on the stopwatch for the point of interest and the position. And we'll move forward to about 2 seconds. And I'll press the C key to get my zoom tool. And we'll start zooming in. And then grab the directional tool. And then maybe we'll move forward another 12 frames. And grab the orbit tool. And before I forget, I'm going to hold down on the mouse and drag across the timeline to select all of my keyframes. I'll right-click on one of them and select Keyframe Assistant and switch them to Easy Ease. So that way our camera kind of eases into these transitions. Alright, let's watch a quick RAM preview of what we've done so far. And I am liking what I'm seeing, except for a couple things. When we first scrub through the timeline, our camera movement looks pretty good, until we get to the part where it orbits around the fire, where it seems as though our fire shifted over the ground. See how right before we orbit, it appears as though the fire is in front of this crack here, but as soon as we orbit around it, it now appears to be sitting right on the crack. And that's because although the particles are recognized as 3D layers, they still don't always behave the way we want them to when we're compositing them on top of other 3D layers. To illustrate this point, we'll go back to our fire, and we'll open CC Particle World, and we'll bring down the Y position. See, the fire's not going through the floor like any other 3D object would, even though we know that we rotated our floor 90 degrees. Now, there's really no easy way of solving this problem other than trying to link our particles to a null object using an expression that was created by Andrew Kramer of VideoCopilot.net. And if you'd like a further in-depth look at this expression, I recommend you head over to his website and check out some of those tutorials. To create this expression, we're going to first need to create a new null object and turn it into a 3D layer, and then we'll open up its position by pressing P. We'll select our fire and go up to the position X and alt-click on the stopwatch. And in the text box, sorry, you can't see it here, we'll type X equals, and then we'll grab the pick whip and pull it up to the X position of the null. And then after it, we'll type minus this comp dot width divided by 2. We'll hit enter, and under it we'll type x divided by this comp dot width. And we're going to copy this expression 2 more times. So we'll click back in the text box and do Control C. And then we'll move down to the position Y, and I'll click on the stopwatch and hit Control V. Pull this down, and we'll change the 0 to 1 and change width to height. We can close out of that, and then we'll alt-click on the position Z, Control V, and delete everything up to the 0, and change the 0 to 2. And now we'll close this up, select our null, and start moving it around. And as you can see, it is now 3D. And we'll just start pulling it until it touches the ground, which it's actually a lot further away from the ground than I thought. We'll reach the ground eventually. Okay, so I just cut out a little bit of recording because I was having a difficult time trying to position the fire to the floor. I failed to try the easiest thing of all, which was just to take the Y position of our ground and copy it and then paste it to our null object. And this is what we end up with. And let me just line this right up against the crack so I can show you. We can just delete these keyframes. And we'll bring this back to fit our screen. And we'll do a quick RAM preview. And now our fire remains fixed to the floor. And I think I'm going to drag these keyframes out just a little bit more. Actually, maybe to about 3 seconds. Now we'll just add one more thing to our composition, and then we'll jump back into CC Particle World to do some quick touching up. We'll create a new solid, and we'll call this ramp. And then we'll choose Effect, Generate, Ramp, and we'll drop it just above our fire. We'll then select our fire, go over to the track mat, and change it from None to Luma Matte. That way we've created some transparency to our fire without washing out the color. So we'll jump back into CC Particle World and just start fine-tuning a few extra things. Now the one thing we can change is we can give our fire a little bit of a wider base so that it starts off nice and big, and as it rises up, fades to something a lot smaller. And the way we do that is by increasing the birth size and decreasing the death size. And maybe I'll play with the gravity a little bit more. Okay, so really the last thing I did was try to give it a little bit more sporadic movement by animating the resistance with one more wiggle expression. So remember, to do that, just alt-click on the stopwatch, and in the text box, type wiggle 2, 5. Close parentheses and close out of the box. And let's just scrub through here and see what we've got. Maybe we can go 3 times a second. And you can see now, as the fire moves, it kind of pulls itself up and down. I think I'm going to bring the blur down just a little bit. Maybe about 18. And if the fire's moving a little too fast for you, you can right-click on it, go to Time, and click on Time Stretch, and bring it out, maybe try 250. And let's see what we've got. And there you have it. The rest is all up to you. Some of it's subjective, but for the most part, this is a pretty good looking effect. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at stevopiaproductions@gmail.com. From the Cow, this is Steve Liederbach, and until next time, take care and good luck. Thanks again.